SoundCloud, and okay, ready to go. So Siri Carpenter is talking to us today from Madison, Wisconsin. Is that where you are right now?
Yep.
So she's a science journalist based in Madison. She got her master's and her PhD in psychology from Yale after receiving a bachelor's degree from University of Wisconsin-Madison. You liked it there. You went back. She was previously a AAAS Mass Media Fellow at the Richmond Times-Dispatch and has written for a ton of publications since then. And I don't think I've got Amanda still on my screen. Who is everyone seeing?
You.
Me. Okay, good. Perfect. There we go. So in 2010, she founded the Open Notebook, which is just a stellar resource for science journalists. And she's also the president of the National Association of Science Writers. She is the editor-in-chief of TON, which is short for the Open Notebook. And she just released a book that she edited called The Craft of Science Writing, which is full of curated stories from the TON website. Today she's going to talk to us about breaking into science writing, and I can't think of a better person to do that. So, Siri.
Thank you so much, Burley. Thanks a lot for having me as part of the SciCommers, NPR SciCommers community, and thanks to all of you for being here. I can only see about 3 of you on the top of the screen, but I think that there's about 18 or 20 people here, so I'm really glad that you could join in and happy to chat with you. I thought I'd start by telling you, excuse me, just a little bit about how I broke into science writing, with the huge caveat that that was 20 years ago. And so some things might be familiar experiences to some of you, and some things may feel like they were from the Jurassic era. I went, as Burley said, I was a graduate student in psychology at Yale University when I had this epiphany that science writing was a thing. And the reason I realized that after several years of kind of thinking I'd like to write about science and think about science, but not necessarily do the science, and just not realizing that that was a job, I was reading the New York Times Tuesday science section, and one day just kind of went, this is these people's job. So that's a job. So that could be my job. Well, I want that job. And so I went home and entered, there was no Google, but there was Alta Vista, and I went and entered science writing into Alta Vista, and it was kind of like a little experiment, like, is science writing a thing? And what I found out was that there's a National Association of Science Writers, which told me, first of all, aha, so that's a thing. There's a national association of these people. And secondly, the NASW website had, if you can believe it, a list of people, science writers who have email. Back then, it was like 1997 or so. And so I emailed all those people, and like all 20 of them or whatever. And the only person I think I heard back from was a science writer named Charles Seif, who now is a journalist and professor at NYU, but he was a young science writer at the time. And he wrote back and he gave me just a lot of information about what science writing is and how it works, and kind of helped me develop more focused questions. And he told me about the AAAS Mass Media Fellowship program, which I'll mention again later, but I think a lot of you are probably already aware of it. And so I got up the courage to go talk to my advisor and tell her that I was interested in getting into science writing. And I was really afraid that she would be like, well, then get out of here. And I was really fortunate that she was incredibly supportive, actually. And I kind of spewed out the things that I had to say to her, which I had role played with one of my lab mates and anticipated all of her objections and stuff. And then she didn't object at all. And she just was like, well, if you want to do that, then I support that, and I'll support you to do that well. So I was very, very fortunate in that. And I know that that is not the case. It wasn't the case then for a lot of people. And I think it's still not the case for a lot of people in science who are interested in getting into science writing. But she supported me to get into that in the form of letting me take off summers from the lab and do internships. And so I was lucky to get a AAAS Mass Media Fellowship. And then the next summer, I got an internship at Science News, and that's kind of what got me on my way. So that's my quick version, as quick as I can make it, of how I got into science writing. And then I worked for a couple of years for a magazine, the APA Monitor, the magazine of the American Psychological Association. And then around just after 9/11, my first daughter was born, and my husband and I felt like life is short and we want to get back to Wisconsin where our families are. And so I decided to go freelance and become a freelance science journalist from Madison. And that's where I've been living since 2002. And I've freelanced I have been a freelancer for most of my career. I had a brief interlude of about 18 months as an editor at Discover magazine after Discover moved to Milwaukee. But commuting from Madison to Milwaukee was kind of grueling. And so I only managed it for 18 months before I couldn't take it anymore. And went back to freelancing, but then I was editing. And by then my colleague and I had formed the Open Notebook, and it was starting to grow. And over the years, the Open Notebook has become a larger and larger portion of my working life, to the point now where it's more than full-time. I hardly do anything other than edit for the Open Notebook, run the Open Notebook, except that I edit for a really great magazine for middle schoolers called Science News for Students, which I encourage all of you to read. I really love it. So that's my background in a nutshell. Today, I wanted to talk with you about getting into science writing from science. And I have a number of kind of bits of advice about how to do that, some of which I'm sure will be familiar to some of you. Don't feel like you need to write any of this down. I'm happy to send out notes, especially where I'm just like listing off Twitter hashtags and things like that. I'm happy to share these notes with you. So my first piece of advice, if you want to be a science writer, is that you do a lot of reading. And that includes, of course, reading about science. And you can do that in a number of different types of venues, the types of publications that scientists read, for example, like The Scientist, Science and Nature and PLOS and PNAS. And then reading publications that are intended for a public that is interested in science, like Scientific American and Undark and Quanta and Science News and High Country News and Grist and other publications like that. And then finally, general interest publications that do a great job covering science. And so that includes publications like, of course, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the Guardian, BuzzFeed News, Vox, etc., Vice, Outside. So do a lot of reading. And I want to recommend that when you're doing that reading of science stories, that you're doing it in a particular way. First of all, just to enjoy the stories, because after all, that's probably why you want to be a science writer, is that you enjoy those kinds of stories, but also reading with a purpose, the purpose of studying the craft. And so how you do that is, of course, variable from person to person. One thing that you can do is you can do what some people call reverse outlining stories. So take a story and take a notebook and try to figure out, what is the structure of this story? What does the first paragraph do? What does the second paragraph do? Where in the story does a main character get introduced? Are there two kind of storylines that are woven together in that story? And try to kind of dissect it in that way. Another thing you can do, and this is something that I break down in a chapter in The Craft of Science Writing, is to do a type of close read. And there's a chapter in the book called How to Do a Close Read. And it suggests a ton of different ways that you can read a story and do so for the purpose of understanding the craft. So questions that you can ask yourself about the story. You would absolutely not want to ask yourself all these questions about any given story, because there are dozens of them and you would exhaust yourself and it would not be a fruitful exercise. But what you can do is take a story that you've read it once and kind of enjoyed it, and you want to understand, how did the writer do that? And pick out, I'm going to say, 3 to 5 questions from that how to do a close read list, and try to answer those questions about that story. And then, you maybe want to do more after that, or maybe you want to you're tired of that story at that point. You feel like you've learned something, you set it aside. And then the next time you read a story that really grabs you, do the same thing. Or it might be a story that doesn't grab you, but everyone is talking about it and you can't really understand why everyone's talking about it. So you can do this and just kind of interrogate that story, asking the kinds of questions that we lay out in that chapter on how to do a close read. So when you're reading science stories, I'm recommending that you do it with that in that kind of intentional way. And then finally, read about science writing and journalism. Of course, I would be remiss if I did not recommend that you read the Open Notebook. We have a section at the Open Notebook, a special collection called Getting Started in Science Journalism, which is a great place to start. It's just a collection of our articles that we think are particularly valuable for people who are just getting started. We also have a series called A Day in the Life, which is mini profiles of science writers. And so if you're trying to get a sense of what is the life of a science writer like, there's a few dozen of those that you could read. And then there's a chapter in the book by Julia Rosen that's about breaking into science writing from science. And so I highly suggest reading that article. I'll talk today about a lot of the things that she talks about in that chapter. I also recommend a couple of other books. The Science Writer's Handbook, which was published in 2013 and is still really valuable, widely used. That book is broken down into 3 sections: how to pitch stories, how to publish stories, and how to prosper as a science writer. So it's aspirational, the prospering part, but it's basically about the craft and the business and the lifestyle of science writing. And then there's a book called The Field Guide for Science Writers, which was published. It's the official guide of the National Association of Science Writers. It was published in 2006, so it's getting pretty old, but it's still heavily read. There are parts of it that will be entertaining because in 2006, of course, it was a whole different era with the internet, but there are very, very many timeless lessons in there. And so I recommend that book as well. And I recommend the Open Notebook's new book, The Craft of Science Writing. I also recommend tuning into the Nieman Storyboard if you're not familiar with it. It's not about science writing, but it's about narrative storytelling. And then also the Nieman Foundation has several journalism-related projects at Harvard, which you might be aware of. Nieman Storyboard is one of them. There's another publication, a bigger one, called Nieman Lab, which publishes a lot of industry news and information. So if you're really just trying to dig into and understand the journalism world in particular, Nieman Lab is great, as is the Columbia Journalism Review. And then finally, I just wanted to mention I have many favorite podcasts, and I decided to not get into a listing of podcasts here. Obviously, all the NPR podcasts are my first love. But the long form podcast, as someone who likes to break down how stories get done, I really enjoy the long form podcast, which is interviews with writers about how they approach different stories. So that all falls under the umbrella of reading what I think you should read and the kinds of things and how to do it. Secondly, finding your community in science writing is really important. You all have done that by virtue of the fact that you're part of the NPR SciCommers group. And when I talk with others about finding community, that's one of the first things I recommend is look into NPR SciCommers. But there are other ways as well. The first way is finding community through Twitter. And I think you have a science writing Twitter thing coming up, so I'll try not to steal too much from that concept, but I just wanted to mention a few hashtags that are valuable to follow on Twitter if you're interested in science writing. And again, you don't have to write these down, I can send these notes, but SciComm, science journalism, science writing, and SciEngage are good places to start. And then the Open Notebook also has a Twitter list that I just made public this morning, and you're welcome to follow it. It's Friends of Ton, and it's basically all of the Ton writers, editors, board members, people who we've interviewed, members of the Ton team, people who've been our fellows or mentors in our fellowship program. So it's 200 and some people. So if you just want to be following a bunch of science writers all at once who I think are great, then I would recommend the Friends of Ton Twitter list. For finding community, I highly, highly recommend going to the NASW meeting, or I should say the Science Writers meeting, which is held each October. The Science Writers meeting is a joint meeting of the National Association of Science Writers and the Council for the Advancement of Science science writers, and it's several days of workshops, professional development workshops, and also scientist talks and science communication workshops. So that, to me, that meeting is hugely valuable. I've gone, I think, all but 2 years out of the last 20. The 2 years I had just had babies, I didn't go, but otherwise I always go to that meeting. I am biased because I'm on the board of directors of NASW right now, but I swear that I would recommend that meeting even if I weren't on the board. Of course, membership in NASW or other organizations is really valuable. So others besides NASW that you could think about are the Society of Environmental Journalists, the Association of Healthcare Journalists, and the Society of Professional Journalists. These membership organizations are expensive. You're probably not going to join them all, but kind of over time you can figure out where your home feels like it is. There are also a lot of regional science writing groups. I know of about 20, and you can find them if you Google SciCommers, and I'll send out this link, but there's a listing of all of these regional science writing groups at that website, scicongress.org. You guys are probably familiar with ComSciCon. That is obviously a place where a lot of people have found a really meaningful science writing community. There's another group called Science Talk, which has an annual meeting every March in Portland. And I haven't been to that meeting yet, but I'm hoping to go this year. And I hear that it's really great, that it's a real community of people who do science communication, people who do other kinds of science writing and science journalism. And then the Sigma Xi organization is one that probably a lot of you, if you're on campuses, exists on your campus. And that is another place that a lot of people who are in science and interested in science communication have found community. I also recommend getting practice as a science writer. And there are a lot of different ways that you can do that. You might have discovered that it's kind of hard to just respond to job ads and get gigs if you don't have experience as a science writer. So getting some of that early experience is really important. One way to do that is if you're a graduate student and your grad program offers any kind of exposure to science writing or communication, do it. Like at Harvard, for example, I know that they have the Science in the News, which is a grad student organization that tries to bridge the communication gap between scientists and non-scientists. So that's a writing opportunity for scientists who are interested in SciComm. And similar organizations are popping up at other universities. You can also take or audit a writing or journalism class, and that might be at your university or it might be at a university adjacent to you. When I was in grad school at Yale in psychology, there was no journalism program there, but I took the one and only journalism class I've ever taken was at Quinnipiac College, now Quinnipiac University. And it was just like a night school journalism class, and it just let me dip a toe in and start to understand a few basics of like really what it means to do journalism. It wasn't about science, but I got to meet some other people who were wanting to be journalists and just kind of get exposure to that area. If you take a journalism class, you'll learn a lot about like the ethics of journalism. You'll get experience being edited. You'll get clips that you might be able to use for job applications or freelance pitches. Also, student newspapers and magazines are a good place to start to get practice doing science writing. University research magazines and alumni magazines. And then there are journals and scientific society websites that sometimes take guest writers. Like one that I'm familiar with is the PLOS ECR community, which is it's an outlet for students and postdocs who are learning to be science writers to get experience. And I don't know with that one whether that's a paid opportunity or not. Obviously, whenever you can, look for paid opportunities. But some of these early practice opportunities may be unpaid ones, like at student newspapers, for example. And then there are publications like The Conversation and Massive Science that offer opportunities for scientists to write for the public. And they're used to working with scientists, and their pieces sometimes get picked up by other news outlets. So then you have some nice clips under your belt. There's also local newspapers and alt weeklies. You can also just try pitching single study stories that you find interesting. You might find them at, at PubMed, or, maybe about something that is going on in a friend's lab or something. That's something that you're not too close to write about journalistically. And you can pitch those stories to magazines, newspapers, websites. And, if you find them exciting and you want to give it a try, there's no credential that you need to obtain before you can pitch a story on a freelance basis. If you're not familiar with the Open Notebooks pitch database, that can be a place to learn the art of pitching. We have over 200 successful pitch letters to various publications, news pitches and feature pitches. So that's a way to study pitching. In the book, we have a chapter about how not to pitch, and that's as important as knowing how to pitch. In How Not to Pitch, it talks about, it's a round table with a bunch of editors, all of whom have moved on to other positions by now, but because that's the nature of the industry, but talking about their pet peeves and kind of good aspects of good pitch hygiene and so on. Then in terms of finding training opportunities, I mentioned the AAAS Mass Media Fellowship. That is the biggie in the world of internships, especially for people coming out of science. But there are many, many others. Science, Nature, Inside Science, Knowable, National Geographic, NPR, PBS NewsHour, many publications have internships for science writers. And so that is a really important way to get training, is to do an internship. And a lot of science writers who are coming out of PhD programs or who already have PhDs might not feel like they're up for any more actual school. That was the case for me. Like after, I was 30 years old and I had a baby and I had been in school for what felt like my entire life. And the idea of doing one more degree program just kind of felt impossible at the time. And so the internships that I had were super, super important. And when it comes to internships, I would really say to be persistent. The Open Notebook has an early career fellowship program, and we have had people who have applied 3 times to our fellowship program before getting it because it's just so competitive, but there's nothing wrong with their applications. If we could, we'd take 20 people each year, but we don't have the funding for that. But we get really great applications, and if you don't get an internship, whether it's our fellowship or something else right away, don't be discouraged and think that it must be that you're not cut out for this or you've done something wrong. And then finally, of course, there are many different science writing graduate programs. Some of the more well-known ones are the ones at UC Santa Cruz, MIT, NYU, Columbia, University of Colorado at Boulder. There are many, many different science writing programs. Some of them are more focused on journalism. Some are specifically focused on health or environment. But there are a lot of them. Unfortunately, I'm not aware of any one place where there is a list of all of them. So it takes some detective work to find them, but they do exist. So those are kind of the main avenues for getting training, kind of the DIY method that I mentioned, all the different ways you can get experience while you're in school or on your campus or wherever you are in your academic life, internships, and then the science writing graduate programs. So I wanted to talk a bit today about some kind of important misconceptions that I think people have about science writing. But before I do that, I just thought I'd take a break and see if people have any questions about things that I've talked about or things that you would like me to be talking about.
And if you don't want to ask your question on video, you can type it in the chat. I can read it out. I know there's a hand raisey tool, but I always forget how to use it because as the host, I don't have that option, so I can't mess around and find it. Or you can just unmute yourself and Wild West ask your question.
I have a question. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, I was so say you have like a handful of pieces that you've published.
Mm-hmm.
So you have some clips. I guess, do you have any recommendations on how to find places and outlets that are kind of more friendly towards newer writers?
Yeah, and there are some that are really hard. You know, it's exceptionally difficult to get published in the New Yorker. I myself have never been published in the New Yorker. That doesn't mean that anyone can't try. If you have a killer story and you really know that you know how to tell that story, there's no reason you can't try for, you know, aiming high for those places. And there are, at any, like, the highest reaches of journalism, you will find stories that were written by people who were quite new. So it's not impossible anywhere, but of course the bar is really high. And if you're looking to just get a lot more experience, then you might not want to beat your head against the wall forever trying for the New Yorker, when you don't. That's just not the type of story that you have. Many publications, online publications, do work with new writers, and sometimes the pay is lower for newer writers. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes places just have, this is the rate we pay, and it doesn't really matter whether they're getting someone who's published 3 stories or they're getting a really experienced science writer. But if you think about publications that you like to read, there are probably some that aren't as seemingly unattainable as the New Yorker. And there's no reason that you can't pitch those. The key when you're pitching stories is, one, it's got to be a good story. It's got to be a good fit for that publication. So you want to make sure that you've read it enough to understand the kinds of stories that they do, both in terms of their topics, their style, their length, their tone. You know, you want to feel like you kind of understand that publication. It doesn't mean that you are responsible to know every single thing that they've ever published, but you want to pitch something that is a fit for the publication in the first place. And when you're writing a pitch, what you're really trying to sell is that, one, you have a good idea. This is a story that they should want to do at all, even if it were, you know, if it's not that great an idea for them, then it doesn't matter who you are, they're just not going to want to do it. So you want to sell that it's a good idea for them, and you want to sell that you have the chops to do it. And so in your pitch letter, you're trying to show that you have the chops to do that, and why the story is interesting or important, and why you're the person to write it. You're more likely to have success if you are pitching what in the magazine world they call an FOB, or front of book story, like a short little news story, than if you're trying to sell, a 3,000 or 5,000 word feature story, just because it's less risk for a publication. If they assign a story to you of 300 words or 500 words and it just doesn't work out, and like the worst case scenario is it doesn't work out, they have to kill it, they have to pay you a kill fee, and they have to walk away. It was a lot less risk for them if it was a short story than if it was a long one. And so again, if you have a really, really great feature idea, it's not like, oh, you need to wait until you've been writing for 5 years and you have X many clips before you can pitch that. But your chances are greater if you look for smaller things in order to build up your clips. Hey, kitty. So I'm not going to recommend specific publications because I'm not aware of any, apart from ones that are particularly working with scientists, like I mentioned, The Conversation and Massive Science are a couple that I know of. There are many, many publications that work with very early career writers and editors who are happy to do that. And when they find talented people, they want to work with them again. And there's nothing that makes a publication happier than if they work with someone at the beginning of their career and they do really well, and then they get to continue working with them and they've found a writer who they like to work with, and they get bragging rights for having been like one of the people who helped that person start their career.
And I think I'll add, because it sounded like Kama maybe was interested in specific publications, or at least like how to find those specific publications, and that's really hard to do. But one way that I think you can start to get a good ear is your community. So when you start building your community in science writing, science journalism, then you'll have those conversations on an individual level when they have that experience.
Yeah, and you'll start to see who those people are writing for. And, if you are part of a community of people and you start to notice that like a bunch of them have been publishing stories at Hakai magazine, just to name an example, then that might suggest to you that that is a place that is welcoming of early career writers. Or if you see that a bunch of people who are kind of at your career stage are writing for PBS NewsHour, then that might be. So those are clues. You might be wondering how to find who to pitch to at publications. And sometimes that information is readily available on a publication's website, and sometimes it's not. But there is a publicly available Google Sheet out there that was started by a journalist named Robin Lloyd that is super helpful. It has, I'm going to say, hundreds of contacts at publications that cover science. I'm sorry, I don't have the link handy right now, but Burley, maybe we can figure out how to deliver that to people later. It's not secret. It's just that it's not like a website that has a title that you can just Google. And then, of course, you can always ask people for contact information of editors.
Does anyone else have a question before we get on to misconceptions about science writing? Anybody else? Nobody in the chat? Okay.
Okay. Well, so I wanted to talk about, first of all, some important misconceptions about what science writing is. The first one is something that has been a pet peeve of mine for a really long time, and that is the idea that science writing is an alternative career. And probably, like, if I were in a room with you guys and I asked you to raise your hands, how many of you have heard of science writing described or lumped in with other alternative careers? I think a lot of you probably would. And the reason that that bothers me is that it presumes that there's one thing that's normal, and that is being an academic scientist, and anything else is an alternative to that. And it's easy to feel like that when you're in academia, and it's simply not true. And it felt like that to me when I was, when I was looking at leaving academia to be a science writer. There was a period of time, and it probably took me at least a couple of years to start to really internalize this idea that science writing is its own thing. It's its own career path. It's rather a bunch of different career paths, but it has its own standards. It has its own ways of getting training. It has its own codes of ethics. And it is not an alternative to science. It's just a different thing. And so I really like to kind of disavow that idea that science writing is an alternative career, because I think the analog to that a lot of people feel is that it as an alternative it is somehow a lesser alternative. And obviously for some people academic science is the one thing that they really want to do the most, and anything else would be a lesser alternative. But across the board, there's no reason to feel like that about science writing or any other field that is not academic science. Another thing I wanted to mention is that there are a lot of different ways to be a science writer. So, you might be writing about single studies, kind of quick hits, or you might be writing feature stories, or you might be writing profiles, or you might be writing scripts for video or for podcasts, or you might be doing data visualizations, and all of those things fall under the general rubric of science writing. Also, there are many different types of outlets that you can work for. So you might be writing for a university, or you might be writing for a scientific society, or for a journal, or for a museum, or for a journalistic outlet. And even within journalism, of course, there are many different types of publications, and they have many different voices. If you compare, for example, the New York Times versus Vice versus the Chronicle of Higher Education, those are all very different types of work. And if you were a science writer, if we had 3 science writers at each of those places, they would have very different types of working lives. I also want to make the observation that science communication and science journalism are not the same thing. And that may or may not be a familiar distinction for some of you, maybe, and others maybe not so much. They're both important and valuable pursuits, of course, but they're different. And that's not always something that's immediately obvious to early career science writers. A lot of scientists think of all science writing as being some form of outreach, with the primary goal being to translate science for lay people and to be a sort of champion of science. And that may be the case for some science writing jobs, but for others, and namely for journalism jobs, science writing is not all rah-rah science. Um, yes, by and large, science writers tend to love science, and in general, writing about science involves a lot of enjoyment and awe about the way that the world works and the people working to understand it. But many or most science writers consider it to be part of their job to be critical about the whole enterprise and the results as well. And so I think understanding that idea that that's a role of journalism is important. And that's true whether you are working as a journalist or whether you're working as a public information officer, whether you're working in some other area of science communication. One of the most, kind of as a spin-off of that idea, one of the most common issues that journalists who are working with scientists encounter is when scientists expect that a reporter will share their story with them before it's published. Sometimes scientist sources can very, with all good intentions, say, can you send me your story so I can check it, or so that I can review it? And most media outlets disallow that, and most journalists won't do it. And it's not because journalists don't want to fact check, but there are time-tested ways of fact checking journalistic stories, and sending them to sources is generally not permissible. And then finally, I just wanted to mention the concept of conflict of interest. A lot of times when scientists are becoming science writers, they're really eager to write about topics that excite them. And what are the topics that they're most familiar with? It's the studies that they've worked on, or the studies that are being done in their lab, or the studies that their advisor has worked on, or whatever. And so they're quite close to that. And a lot of times people don't begin with an awareness of why writing about your own research or the research of people who you're closely associated with, like your advisor or your departmental colleagues or whatever, poses a conflict of interest, because you are not able to, you don't have an arm's length distance from that work. So it's not that you can't write about it, full stop. It's that there will be outlets where you can't write about that journalistically because you have a conflict of interest. And that can be something that people don't fully appreciate when they're starting out. So for example, when I was in graduate school, I was studying implicit bias, implicit prejudice and stereotyping. And I was working with a researcher named Mahzarin Banaji, she's now at Harvard, but she was at Yale at the time. And I loved that area of research. And it was really hard for me when I became a science writer to not just want to approach every story, every interesting finding about implicit bias, because it was the field I'd worked in. I knew it intimately. I knew like what studies were problematic for what reasons. I just had all of this kind of insider knowledge. But the very insider knowledge that I had was the same reason why it was problematic to write about that. And so I had to be really careful if I was ever writing about that field, that I was not doing it in a way that might be promoting my own advisor, my own former advisor's work, or my own work, or my friends and colleagues' work. And so ultimately it was a field that I didn't write about very much because the conflicts of interest were just so thick in that area. Then I wanted to talk a little bit about misconceptions about learning to do science writing. And the first thing I want to point out is just that there is no single path to science writing. There's a line in the Craft of Science Writing in a chapter by Julia Rosen, who's writing about transitioning from science to science writing. And she quotes an essay by someone named Stephanie Chastain, where Chastain draws an analogy to bacteria that are able to move toward the type of environment that they prefer, like an area that's warm and therefore it's more conducive to their survival. But it's not because they have an overall plan. And what Chastain writes, and Julia quotes in the chapter, is these bacteria, they have no overall map of their surroundings to direct their movement in a straight line towards what they seek. What they sense instead is a local gradient, a small change right next to them. It's a little warmer that way. They move slightly, they feel it out again, they move, feel, move, and feel. The resulting path is a somewhat jagged but non-random path toward the thing that they love. and so is mine. And so Chastine was writing about her path to science communication. And I love that because my own path to science journalism was a jagged one too. And the reason that path sometimes feels difficult is because there basically is no one path. It's not like some other fields. Like, you want to be a lawyer, you're definitely going to go to law school. You want to be a doctor, you're going to go to med school. You want to be a science writer, then there are a lot of different ways that you can do that. And no one of them is right. And part of the fun, but also part of the challenge, is finding your own way into it. And the right way to do it is just like those bacteria, to feel out what's right for you, just one step at a time. I'll take a break here and see if anyone has any questions before I have a few final thoughts.
Yeah, so we've got 12 minutes left, or let's say 10, because I'm going to end the chat pretty promptly on the hour. So anybody throw questions in the chat? Raise your hand if you figured out how to do that. Or I hear somebody's computer's up, so go ahead. No? Nobody? Questions?
Hi. Hi. My name is Karen, and I just got my PhD in chemistry, and so I'm applying for summer internships while waiting for AAAS fellowship to be announced. But so I'm in this in between stage where I'm trying to freelance, and I feel a little lost. Do you have any advice to someone who's in my position? Should I just send out a whole bunch of pitches? What should I do?
Yeah, well, again, there's no one right answer to that. First of all, are you familiar? You're probably familiar with CNEN, Chemical and Engineering News. They have an internship of their own. So in case I just mentioned it, in case you're not familiar with that one, that would be one to check out. They also take freelance. So, and they have a really, really great bunch of editors there. So I would definitely recommend pitching to CNEN because it's right there. It's in your field and it's a great publication. In general, when it comes, your question is, what should you do while you're waiting, in the next several months between now and whatever internship you might begin?
Yes, especially because I feel like a lot of times, as you also mentioned, people go through internship first and then step into science journalism as a career. And I don't have that newsroom experience just now, so I feel a little lost.
Yeah, well, internships will be really valuable. It's not uncommon for people to do 2 or 3 internships. They might add up to, a year and a half, even 2 years of doing internships. And that's one reason that internships should be paid, because very few people could afford to do that. It's hard enough to do it on the pay that most internships offer. But if you can get that newsroom experience through internships, that's excellent. And again, be persistent about that. In the meantime, while you're putting out your applications for internships, yes, I think that if you have the time and bandwidth to do it right now, I'm not sure if you're writing your dissertation right now or anything, but if you're able to devote the time to pitching, then yeah, I think it's a great idea. And sometimes all it takes is a first successful pitch at a publication. And if you do a good job on that story, you very well might start to have regular work, and you won't feel so untethered. At the beginning, it feels like, oh, there's 1,000 publications out there and I'm writing for 0 of them. And so it feels, you just have that sense of being really untethered and lost. I think the biggest things that you can do to just avoid that feeling of being lost are, one, to be doing the work, to be putting out the pitches and, and so on, and going for the internships. But then also to be part of that community. So NPR SciCommers community, of course, and then these other ways of finding community can be really important. If you know that you're interested in being a science writer, you might consider joining NASW as a student member. It's cheap to do that. When you join as a student member, you don't need the writing samples and so on that you have to when you are applying to be a regular member. And then you can be part of the listservs. You can even volunteer to be part of a committee. NASW and other organizations are always looking for volunteers. to help with the, running the organization. And that's a good way to find community. If you're comfortable on Twitter, taking part in conversations about science writing on Twitter, these are all things that can just help you feel like, yes, I'm in this world. Here are the pieces of evidence. It's not just that I've applied for internships. It's not just that I've pitched some stories. It's also that I know the names of science writers and I talk to them. Or I'm a member of this organization. I'm even volunteering, things like that. And it won't be long before you have that greater sense of connection. But I identify with what you're talking about. I remember years of feeling like I would go to the NASW meetings and I would know like one person, and my main task at that meeting basically was to feel like I didn't look pathetic standing around with nobody to talk to, but also not trying to hog like one person's time the whole time. And so I think knowing that that kind of feeling is extremely common. It's not that you're doing anything wrong. It's just kind of the nature of getting into a new field. And maybe when you feel like you're part of it, if you have left science and become a science writer, there's a moment where you're like, why do I have these rows of journals, old journals? For me, like the day when I decided to get rid of all of my old psychology journals was kind of a day when I realized I now have fully internalized this new identity of being a science writer, and I don't need to have all of those years and years worth of journals anymore.
Thank you.
So we've got about 5 minutes left. We've got one question in the chat. What skill that you learned in grad school has been the most helpful to you in your career as a science writer? So if you want to address that in about a minute, and then any other closing thoughts you have.
What skill? I would say that maybe the most important thing to be a successful science writer is curiosity. It's not a skill per se. Like understanding statistics that's helpful, and being able to craft an elegant sentence is something that comes with time. And but like there are these soft skills that I think are the most important things. Having curiosity, having just a high regard for facts and accuracy, and being able to meet deadlines on time. Those are the three things I think are most important.
Great. All right. Do you have any closing thoughts?
Yes, I do. I like to talk about imposter syndrome because it's a familiar term to most people, but I think that even though that's the case, people often, they think that really, yes, there are people out there who feel like imposters and they're not. That's ridiculous that those successful people feel that way, but surely there are imposters out there, and what's to say that I'm not one of them? I have felt that way many, many times in my career, and I don't anticipate that that's a feeling that will ever entirely go away. It rears its head at times where I'm trying something new. It rears its head at times where I'm with new people who I'm not as comfortable with. It rears its head at times when I'm in some type of leadership role that I haven't experienced before. And the thing about imposter syndrome is that as I say to my kids, like, imposter syndrome is just an asshole, and it just kind of needs to be punched in the face. But it's a real thing, and it's probably never going to entirely go away. But so what do? You acknowledge it. You, at times when you're having these moments saying like, yeah, I'd like to do this thing. I'd like to do a mentor chat on NPR SciCommers, but I've never done that before. I hope I don't do a terrible job at it. You just kind of let yourself have that thought, and then you think, that's my imposter syndrome talking, but I'm going to do this anyway. And how am I going to do it? I'm going to prepare for it. And, have faith that the reason that this job sometimes feels hard is not because there's something wrong with you or because you're not cut out for it. It's just because it's hard. And it's like anything that's a skill that takes time to learn, and you sometimes are learning faster than others. Sometimes you fail and learn from those failures. And those things are all just part of the job. And so for anyone who's feeling like this is daunting, it's so different from my academic life, I don't know if I could do it, I just want to give encouragement to just acknowledge and also reject the imposter syndrome.
Thanks, Siri. I think everyone would agree that you did a great job, and we're very happy that you came and spoke with us.
Thank you.
There is one more question, but we're getting a little bit close, and it's super long. So if you've got a 30-second answer. I feel like traditionally science writing consists of specifically taking a science topic and creating a story about that concept. I now have some writing experience under my belt, but I don't know if it counts as science writing. I've written some profiles about scientists and their work and sci artists. Do these count as science writing, even if I'm not focusing on a specific scientific topic? I'm specifically trying to build my portfolio for science writing master's programs.
Yep, they count. Yes, there are all kinds of things that count as science writing. So you could do a Q&A with a scientist and you talk a little bit about their science and their feelings about science and the science art that they do or whatever, and that's science writing. So you don't need to be covering a study as news. You don't need to be writing a feature that's diving deep into some big question in science. There are, science writing comes in many, many different flavors.
Great. All right. Perfect. We're doing so great on time. Thank you again so much. This really was such a great mentor chat. And I will get those notes from you. And then when I post this video in the Slack channel, then I will also post that bullet point resources list.
Great. Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it. And anyone feel free to be in touch anytime. My email is siricarpenter@gmail.com.
And I can put that in the chat also, or the channel.
Great.
Great. Everyone have a great day, and I'll see you next month.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.